We're thrown into a world that we know pretty much nothing about. If you followed the talks on Kant, you'll appreciate by now that we only know our own representation of the world anyway. But there are drivers within us that are contradictory, and there seems to be no way around them. It's a kind of setup, and if I was a conspiracy theorist, I would I would be saying that it's fucking aliens or something. Anyway, I'm not. There are probably just laws at work that put us in a fairly invidious situation that we can't get out of. And it's the cause of a great deal of suffering. So, here's the setup. The first thing is that we strive to live. With all our being, we strive to live. And I've covered that before in detail, procreation, finding a social environment, getting money, getting shelter, getting food. That's what we largely concern ourselves with, and that's all simply in order to continue living. And as Schopenhauer points out, our head brain is largely the servant of the body, in the sense that it's forever trying to figure out ways to get money, to be more successful with the opposite sex or whatever, because procreation clearly is a big part of this. But anyway, we strive to live, and with all our effort we do that. If you're ill, you will, as Spinoza points out, you will do anything to try and find a cure for that illness. Most people will anyway. But here's the setup. We strive to live, and yet we know for certain that we will die. Does it really matter whether you die when you're 30 years old or 70 years old? Well, I don't have an answer for that. And maybe it depends on the individual life, but at the end of the day, we all die. So, here's the setup, here's the tension. We strive with all our being, all our body. Every cell in our body wants to survive. Everything about us wants to survive. And yet, we know we will die. There's no resolution of that. People try various things, which I'll mention later, but there's no resolution. You want to live, but you will die. It's not just wanting, it's everything about you. It's what Spinoza calls the conatus, or Schopenhauer calls the will to life. It's what you are, and what you are turns to nothing. By the way, I should say that this is a triple X one. There's some people who like them and some people who don't. Now, it's not as though this scenario, where we strive with all our being to exist, is a neutral kind of thing. It isn't. It means that we compete for resources. Whether those resources are mates, or money, or property, or whatever. We compete. Now, as Spinoza points out, if we could use our reason, we would see ourselves, he doesn't say this explicitly, but chapter 16 in the Theological Political Treatise, he basically says, well, we're made so that the guy with the AK-47 is going to rule the roost. But actually, we can't really live like that. You just end up with brutes fighting it out, and then you're left with the strongest brute who doesn't know how to do anything, even how to replace a battery in a phone or something. So we can't live like that. So ideally we need to use reason to set up a state, and men need to collaborate and all that kind of thing. And to some extent we do that, but in reality at a personal level we do not, in the main, collaborate. And as Spinoza points out, we need to collaborate because the universe is essentially hostile. He implies that many of the laws in the universe will be hostile to the needs and wants of man. He says something to the effect of there are much larger laws at play. Because something doesn't seem right or fair or just or whatever to us, doesn't mean that it isn't running along according to some kind of law. So we need to help each other, but the Conatus ensures that we compete with each other. We use each other, we take from each other, we create misery and suffering for each other. If you look at what's happening in the UK at the moment, it's unbelievable. A bunch of toffs and rich people want to avoid paying tax, so they've convinced the rest of the United Kingdom to come out of the European Union, which has tax evasion laws, so that they can avoid tax. And when the UK leaves the European Union supposedly on the 29th of October or something like that, then those laws go by the way, and these people save themselves a whole pile of money. And the ordinary people in the UK cannot see that the only people pushing this, really funding it, are rich people. I won't go into all of that. But, here we are. Here's a group of people set on harming most of the population in the UK, because most of the population are getting nothing out of this. The people and organisations that should have been paying tax to help fund schools and all the rest of it are not going to be paying tax. So, we end up with a few people. They're Conatus, they're striving for power, their ability to pull off a huge heist, and the masses of people. And in Great Britain there are already food banks, people would starve otherwise, and a growing proportion of people who live in poverty, despite all the hype about full employment and so on. Anyway, so we need to help each other, but we don't, we compete. So, the first part of the setup. We strive to live with all our being, but eventually we die. The second part of the setup, we need to help each other, but we don't. We compete with each other and cause each other misery. Part 3 of the ethics, if you want the details. So those are the first two parts of the setup. The third part of the setup. If we could understand reality, and particularly the reality of the situation we find ourselves in, we could to some extent free ourselves from it. We could agree to work together, to minimize the harm that nature brings upon the human race. As Spinoza says, God, or nature, is the cause of our suffering, but through understanding that we can derive pleasure. Well, that's another story, but at the end of the day, let's make no mistake about it, we didn't create this setup. We're born into it. But through understanding reality, we don't have to be wholly passive victims. We can relieve ourselves and possibly even derive some pleasure from understanding the situation. But, as Gurdjieff says, we prefer to perceive reality topsy-turvy. So the fact that we strive with all our being and then die isn't something your average person is going to want to hear. The fact that we need to work together, but typically we are in a position of envy, where we want someone else to experience bad fortune, and are full of hatred when they experience good fortune. This understanding is generally not available. Well, it's available, but people don't want it. They want fairy tales. As Gurdjieff says, they want to see the world topsy-turvy, upside down. So instead of seeing the real nature of man's relationship with man, we build a topsy-turvy version, which is political correctness, me too, anything to pretend that we're all getting along together nicely, when actually we're not. We're competing. Most people will lie and cheat to gain an advantage over somebody else. But we want the fairy tale. So, the third part of the setup, so number 1, we want to live but we die. Number 2, we should help each other but we compete. Number 3, we should try and understand reality, but actually we prefer fairy tales. And those fairy tales can be very, very sophisticated. You don't have to go to a child's book. The fairy tale can be about a man in the sky who looks after you, that you pray to, or something that you pray to. Or maybe the fairy tale could be that we're all part of the Atman. Do we have any evidence for all of this? No. Can we figure some of this out in some way? Well, possibly, but that requires reason, not just fairy tales. So, you could be a forest spirit. You could be angel dust. You could be any of these fantasies that people create to make life bearable for themselves. And it sounds like I'm being judgmental. I guess in a way I am, but the reality is, to use the immortal words of John Lennon, whatever gets you through the night. If it's angel dust, then, fine. But angel dust will cause you problems, because when you want your angel dust, it won't be there, and you'll feel abandoned, and you'll desperately search for something outside yourself, when actually what you really need is something within yourself, which I'll get to shortly. So those are the 3 parts of it so far. Number 4, and the last one. I'm sure there are others, but I don't want this to go on too long. We are naturally inclined to become attached to people and things that give us pleasure. This is the 4th part of the setup. So, we live a life where maybe we have children, maybe we have friends that we're particularly fond of, obviously parents, maybe a partner that we are particularly fond of, that we love in the sense of they bring us pleasure, not trivial pleasure, but real pleasure in the sense of enhancing us in life. But we know that they will die, and they could die any moment. And then there are things. Maybe you live in a place that you really like, but for whatever reason you can't pay the mortgage, and so the man's going to come knocking on the door one day telling you to leave, and your house is boarded up. Anyway, so we become attached to things. That is a natural inclination for us. And yet we know that any of those things could cause us pain. So it's a fairly good setup, isn't it? We strive to live, but we die. We need to help each other, but we compete. We need to understand reality, but we prefer fantasies. And we, if we're going to avoid pain, should not become attached to things, but remain kind of aloof. And really that was Spinoza's approach to it. In fact, a lot of the religions and philosophies go down that route, which is, well, this is all a pile of shit. Let's look for something outside of the pile of shit. For Spinoza, it was God and the laws of the universe, and basically he tried to transcend himself through his mind. The Buddhists kind of do the same thing, not to become attached. And the Stoics did the same thing. And yet, why are these people doing all this? And this is me speaking now. Well, it's me speaking all the way through it, but this is me being a little bit critical of all these things. Why do these people avoid attachment, maybe some kind of ascetic life? Because they're afraid of pain. They don't want pain. Well, what if you say, well, it seems to me that pain is part of the game? Then what do you need to handle that? Only one thing: courage. So instead of running away, either physically or mentally, from the world, you say, well, fuck it, this is a setup I'm born into. It will be painful. I didn't ask for it. I didn't set this whole thing up. But if I'm going to live a reasonable life, then I need courage instead of running away. And if something horrible happens to some close relative or something, I need courage. This is the shit show I'm part of. I will strive with all my being to continue to exist, but I know I'm going to die. You need courage to hold those two in your mind together. You know, most people think they're going to live forever. And then people need to help each other, but actually everybody I know is kind of competing in some way. Trying to big themselves up, or actually trying to take money from me, you know, the local sales guy selling this, that, or the other. And so you need to hold those two in your mind and understand the gravity of that situation, that people are creating suffering for themselves. And then to understand reality, well, you certainly need courage for that. And then to be attached to people and things. I produced a podcast quite a long time ago now called Be Attached to Everything, or something like that. To be attached to everything is to be attached to nothing, but that's a whole other podcast. But be attached to everything. Be fucking attached to it. Do not be attached to the notion of non-attachment. It leads nowhere. I was involved with some people many years ago who would say that grief, for example, was actually a beautiful emotion. Painful, but beautiful. Why try and avoid it? That anger was a beautiful emotion. Why try and avoid it? Disappointment was a beautiful emotion. Why try and avoid it? And so on. And this is a legacy that we've got from a whole pile of religious and so-called spiritual mumbo-jumbo. That there is a large class of emotions that we should not enjoy. And in fact, I noticed April on the Corporeal Fantasy Facebook group saying that she enjoyed being unhappy now and then, or maybe more than now and then. She enjoyed it, and that's a very, very big thing, to overcome that duality of these emotions are good and these emotions are bad. Anyway, I'm getting off the point. So here we are. Here's the setup. I've listed it probably 10 times. And the way to deal with it is through courage. Courage and understanding. We need to understand for ourselves. You can forget other people understanding, because 99.999% of people will not want to know anything about this kind of stuff. I don't talk to anybody about it, except on this forum and a couple of people I know. Just, literally 2 or 3 people. So, there you go. That's the setup, and the solution is courage.